Welcome to Chapter 2, Psychological Method. In Part 1 of this chapter, we're going to cover science and the scientific method. Science is all about asking and answering questions, and doing so in a very particular way. Most of what we're going to talk about is going to apply to all kinds of science, not just psychology. And these basic principles of science are fairly universal in that regard. However, we will have some things to keep in mind for psychology in particular. This is, after all, a psychology course. And we'll start with the first consideration, our subject matter. So, psychology is mainly focused on studying human behavior. Though I will add a quick aside and point out that some of us do study animals, though that's usually under the realm of comparative psychology. For example, I work in comparative cognition, where you are comparing one aspect of one species to another. And in practice, a lot of times you end up comparing your species to humans because that's what other scientists and research boards are interested in, so it all comes back to humans in the end. But not always. But since humans are such a main focus of psychology, I should start off by letting you know that humans are pretty terrible study species. We have quite a few issues with humans as subjects. So some things to keep in mind if you're going to study humans, or if you're going to be looking at research that has studied humans. We need to be aware of their complexity. Humans have around 500 million neurons in their brains. That's just the neurons. That's not even getting into how many connections there are between all those neurons. The numbers become astronomical. And if you're trying to figure out which part of the brain or which neurons in the brain are responsible for a particular behavior, it gets very complicated. We also have to consider variability. Every person is different. We have different connections in our brains, we have different experiences, we react in different ways. We are variable. And that brings us to the next point with reactivity, where humans not only react differently between different humans, but we also react in particular ways when we're observed versus not observed. Our behavior is very rarely predictable. So this causes some pretty big problems, again, as I said, if you're trying to study humans. Most of us are trying to study some unobservable mental processes, and in order to get at that, sometimes you have to actually ask people about those processes. Or you can make inferences, where you can start making some assumptions or educated guesses based on tests and the behavior that you're observing. It can all get very complicated, and you might not even be sure that you're actually studying what you meant to study in the first place. So maybe you can understand why some of us don't really like studying humans. They're too complicated, they're too difficult. So what can you do instead? And that brings us to potentially using a model species. And a model species is going to be a model or an exemplar, a system that we can use as sort of a stand-in for humans. Usually something that's going to be a little bit simpler. Maybe you're going to use flatworms because they only have, say, 500 neurons as opposed to 500 million neurons. Or maybe you want to look at mice or rats, which is why we talk about lab rats, because rats can be a model species and they're commonly used in labs. So there are other options. I just wanted to get us into the swing of things where this isn't necessarily going to be as clear-cut as you might think when you start talking about science. I always want to keep things real and point out other things to consider, like the fact that our study species can be really hard to work with. But we'll continue on and get more in line with how the textbook starts the chapter. So early on, I stated that science is all about asking and answering questions. Science is a way of learning about the world around us. But science isn't the only way that we can learn about our environment. There are some other sources that we can use to gain information. People can rely on our own experience, things that you've encountered in the environment. Maybe you dislike birds because you were attacked by a bird. That's something you've learned based on experience. You can also have intuition. Humans really like to use common sense. Sometimes if somebody tells a good story and it kind of logically makes sense that that could be a true situation, maybe without you realizing it, that becomes part of your assumptions about the world. Humans are also prone to listening to authorities. So someone might give a lecture on a particular topic, or maybe you're watching a YouTube video and someone's speaking about a certain thing. Each of these people might be considered an authority. But I do want to point out that all of these sources, all of these other ways of getting information can have limitations. If we're going to be holding science and scientific method as our ideal way of gathering information and learning about our environment, then we can look at these critically as to what they're missing out on that the scientific method has. So personal experience might be great because you encounter a particular situation or a particular behavior or a particular event, but we have to consider that if you're only basing your view of the world on your own experience, you're looking at a sample size of 1. And that's not a pretty good sampling of a population. That's just one person's experience. So that's not really telling you all that much. We can also look critically at intuition, our gut instincts. And humans have a lot of biases. We have some assumptions and some built-in ideas that don't quite work. We run into issues like we remember things that are more memorable. So maybe you drove home and you're really upset and you think, I got stuck at every single red light on the way home. But did you really? Or did the red lights just stick out in your mind because you sat at those lights for longer? And the green lights you got to pass right through, so they didn't really register in your memory. That's a bias, and that can influence how we're viewing our world. And when we get to authorities, that kind of gets back to what I was talking about in my introduction to the course video, where you want to ask, who is it that's telling me this information, and what is their credibility? What makes them an expert, and should I actually trust what they have to say? Sometimes we see people like celebrities who decide to share information. But if you're only listening to them because they're a celebrity and not because they're an expert on that topic, then maybe they're not the best authority, they're not the best source of information to learn about that topic. All about critical thinking. And science and the scientific method is going to give us that. It's going to help us critically evaluate sources, and it's going to help us get to better information. So as scientists, we have to acknowledge that we have all of these biases and flaws, and we should try and find ways to mitigate or reduce those biases and make sure that we have better information, which is going to bring us to the scientific method. Now, when we're trying to use non-biased sources of information, as we try and get towards this scientific method, we're using a process called empiricism. So scientists are empiricists. We're going to use evidence from our senses, evidence from experiments, evidence that we can actually measure as the basis for our conclusions. So we can start making empirical judgments based on things that are actually observed as opposed to based on things like our gut instinct or things that we've heard from others. And so this brings us to the scientific process, or the scientific method, or the empirical method. Everybody seems to have their own preferred name for this, but all of them refer to the same basic idea. And the steps, again, they kind of tend to differ between sources, but they get to the same basic point here. So we're going to break the scientific process down into 5 basic steps for our purposes here. So our first step is that if you want to learn about something, you have to start by identifying a question. What is it exactly that you want to learn about? If you're going to conduct an experiment, what is the purpose of that experiment? What are you trying to find out? Step 2 is to form a hypothesis and start gathering information. So based on that question that you posed, what is your specific prediction? A hypothesis is a specific prediction about what you should observe in your experiment or in your observations. For step 3, we can start testing that hypothesis by actually conducting the research. Maybe we design an experiment. Maybe we start collecting data to look at something. We're going to start finding points of data, and we're going to use that data to test our hypothesis. Step 4 is analyzing that data. Once you've collected it, what did we actually get? What kind of conclusions can we make from looking at that data? And once you've started making some conclusions, you can build a body of knowledge. So you've put together some data. How does that compare to what other people have found? Put it all together, build up some literature, and learn more. So by putting together your knowledge and knowledge from other experiments and other scientific processes, you can start building a theory. And a theory is going to be a collection of formal statements that describe how you think the world is working in relation to your question. Now, if you're not a big fan of numbered lists, then maybe this visual will help you formulate what we're talking about here. So we have a process. You identify your question. You form your hypothesis. You start testing your hypothesis by collecting your data. Once you have your data, you can analyze it and start making some conclusions. And you put those conclusions together with conclusions that other scientists have made, that other researchers have made. And you start thinking critically about it. So you can start looking at your conclusions, your outcomes, and you can ask, did my data, did the information that I collected by doing my experiment, did that support the hypothesis that I originally proposed? So back in step 2, when we formed that hypothesis, did that prediction match what we actually found? And if it did match, then we can say that our experiment supported our hypothesis. Maybe it's supporting the theory that we're building. So we have supporting evidence. Now it's important to note here that you wouldn't say that you have proven your theory. You can only say that you've given evidence that supports that theory. So we are further supporting a theory. But you can't say that you have proven a theory. As scientists, we acknowledge that we have more evidence, and that means that we think we're getting closer to the truth, but we can't be sure that there isn't going to be some better explanation that we come across in the future. So we don't want to say that we found an absolute solution. We don't want to say we found proof. We're just saying that we have support. You can technically disprove a theory, but that's more of a theoretical debate than anything. Some people don't like to say that you have disproven a theory. Some people don't mind it. But in practice, you're probably better off saying that you do support or do not support a theory. So this no supporting evidence would happen if you've formed your hypothesis, you collect your data, you start analyzing it, and maybe your data doesn't match up to what you predicted that you would see. So that would tell you that what you thought was going on, the theories that you were formulating, the specific prediction that you made based on those theories, it wasn't really working. So you have no supporting evidence, so you're going to have to go back and revise. So instead of strengthening that theory that you had, instead of giving you more evidence to support, now you have no supporting evidence, and you should revise your theory and come up with new hypotheses to go from there. Now, I've been using the terms hypothesis and theory, and they are distinct terms, but I do find that every once in a while students have a little bit of trouble telling the two apart. So a hypothesis is going to be a tentative explanation or prediction about some phenomena. So this is something that is specific. You're making a particular prediction about what you would expect to see in a given situation. A theory is something that's a little bit bigger. It's going to be a set of formal statements that explain how and why certain events or phenomena are related to one another, which is a fancy way of basically saying that a theory is a big picture. It's what you think is happening and why. So a theory is what you think's going on in this situation, and the hypothesis would be, given a particular theory, I would expect to see this particular outcome, because that would then line up, or that would match or give support to the theory that we think is going on. So if you want an example for a hypothesis, we could say that I hypothesized that there would be an acoustic difference between male and female black-capped chickadee calls. Basically, in one of my research projects, I made the assumption that male and female black-capped chickadees should sound different. Seems logical enough. This particular hypothesis was not supported because apparently chickadees don't care about sex when it comes to their calls. And if you can't tell, I'm still just a little bit bitter about that outcome. So that hypothesis wasn't supported. My prediction wasn't accurate. So I had to go the route of no supporting evidence and revised my overall theory, which came back to something along the lines of chickadees only seem to care about sex when the vocalization is relevant to reproduction. But that's more of an aside that you really don't need to know about. If we want to talk about an example for a theory, we could talk about something like attachment theory, which is sometimes called a psychological theory, sometimes claimed by other fields, but a mostly psychological theory that was originally proposed by Bowlby, though he was inspired by Melanie Klein, an Australian child developmental researcher. But this particular theory explains how and why humans form attachments to other humans at different stages of their lives. And this theory has been refined and added to and edited by going through this scientific process for decades. So when a certain hypothesis would be proposed, they would run an experiment, they would look at the outcome of that experiment, and if there was supporting evidence, then they figured that their theory was on the right track. If they had no supporting evidence, they would refine their theory, and they'd come up with a new experiment and test some new hypotheses to try and get to a more refined and more processed theory that is fitting the data just a little bit better. Now, when we're doing this scientific process, when we're going through that cycle of testing hypotheses and finding evidence that supports or does not support our theories, we're achieving understanding through something called hypothesis testing. which kind of makes sense because the process involves testing our hypotheses. So we're testing possible explanations through scientific method. And this stands out in contrast against a lot of what our everyday conclusions come from, and even what early science was based on, which is called hindsight understanding. And hindsight understanding is basically that after you see a particular behavior, you would propose an explanation that makes sense in that context. So, for example, maybe you are walking through the park and you see somebody laying on a park bench. So you decide to propose why they might be laying on that park bench. Maybe you think that somebody was tired. Maybe they went out for a walk and they had to walk too far, so they had to lay down on this bench, and they're laying down because they're tired. So you have proposed an explanation for that behavior, and it kind of makes sense in context. Now, if we were trying to figure out why people lay on benches and we were going to use hypothesis testing, well, maybe you'd set up an experiment. Maybe you would stake out all of the park benches in your neighborhood and you would watch what people are doing before they lay down on the park benches. Maybe you would conduct a survey. Maybe you would go up and ask people why they're laying on park benches. So with the hypothesis testing, there's that opportunity for refinement, for support for your theories, getting more evidence that supports a hypothesis, whereas with hindsight understanding, we're kind of left wondering because there isn't any built-in process there to get you closer to a more accurate understanding of the situation. So that's why we are strong proponents of this hypothesis testing, why we really like our scientific method. Now, before we wrap up this section of the chapter, if we're talking about theories and finding support for support that lends us evidence to support a theory, or if we're finding no support for a theory, what would actually make a good theory? What should we be looking for when we're identifying theories that would make them worthwhile? So a decent theory should organize information in a meaningful way. You want it to put together everything that we already know. So if we were thinking about our attachment theory that I mentioned very briefly, well, it should try and organize information from existing experiments looking at attachment. It should organize different predictions that were supported, or maybe it should exclude predictions that were not supported. So you want to organize the information that we have available to us in a way that makes sense and maybe proposes what's going on. Another important quality here is that a good theory should be testable. Sometimes you'll see this listed as a good theory should be falsifiable. And that basically means that the theory should allow you to generate new hypotheses, new predictions, whose accuracy could actually be evaluated by gathering new evidence. Basically meaning that to be a good theory, you have to be able to set up an experiment. You have to be able to gather data to try and test it. So this excludes things like maybe the theory of governments monitoring your thoughts. There's a lot of good conspiracy theories that don't actually qualify as good theories because no matter what evidence you would present to someone who believes in these conspiracy theories, they would never be able to, disprove the theory. So you could never tell them that, there are no radio waves around you, so there's no radio wave monitoring of your thoughts. If their response is going to be, well, that's what they want you to think, or I don't trust that, then you can't really test that theory. That's an extreme example, but when you're trying to look at theories, you do want there to be the opportunity to find evidence that would not support the theory, evidence that would make you reconsider and reconstruct that theory. And if that's possible, then that's another check mark for it being a good theory. If we're talking about a good theory organizing information in a meaningful way, that kind of goes along with the idea that the predictions that are generated from a good theory should be supported by existing research. So if you've organized all that existing information in a meaningful way, then it makes sense that predictions that are made based on your theory match what you already know. And our last point is that a good theory should conform to the law of parsimony. And now you might not be familiar with the law of parsimony, but you might be familiar with Occam's razor. And this is the idea that all things being equal, the simplest explanation is usually the best explanation. So when you're trying to conduct science, you always try and find the simplest explanation, because you have to start somewhere. So maybe you're trying to explain why birds vocalize a particular way. A simple explanation would be that they vocalize this way because it allows sound to carry in their environment. It's a fairly simple explanation, it seems fairly logical. That should conform to parsimony. If you propose something like birds sing in a particular way because once in the past they heard another bird sing in that particular way, and then they heard a different bird sing in a very different way, and they chose the best of those two, maybe that's not as parsimonious. As you start adding extra things, extra caveats, and extra information to your explanation, that doesn't necessarily make it a better theory. So you want to start as simple as possible. Now that doesn't mean that all theories are simple. If you run an experiment and you have evidence that's given that does not support your theory, then you might go back and revise your theory and add an extra step. Maybe you make it a little bit more complicated to now match the additional information that you have. So you can add more steps, you can add complexity to try and accommodate new information, but you only add that complexity as the data requires it. You don't start complicated and try and cut it down, you start simple and build up. So that's the logic behind that part. And we will leave the lecture there, and we'll move on to part 2 in the next one.